Subcommittee will come back to order, and Dr. Gooding, we will resume with your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Deal and members of the subcommittee. My name is Diane Gooding, Associate Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My primary areas of research are identifying and validating individuals at risk, indicators of heightened risk for schizophrenia, and then identifying and studying at-risk individuals. While summarizing current schizophrenia research, I'd like to illustrate the ways in which focusing on genetic markers of risk for schizophrenia can help us to better understand and combat this devastating mental disorder. Although there are currently some palliative treatments for schizophrenia, the specific biological mechanisms underlying the disorder are currently unknown, and the goals of schizophrenia research are focused on identifying the pathophysiology and etiology of the disorder and eventually preventing the disorder. Now, contrary to earlier notions about schizophrenia, it's not due to bad parenting or personal failure. Schizophrenia is an equal opportunity disorder. It affects people of all socioeconomic groups, all ethnicities and races. The typical age of risk is between late adolescence and early adulthood, and the consensus right now is that schizophrenia is a genetically mediated neurodevelopmental disease. We know that genes are necessary but not sufficient for the development of schizophrenia. As a group, people with schizophrenia differ from healthy people in terms of their neurocognitive performance. People with schizophrenia show impairments in terms of executive functioning, for example, attention, inhibition, response planning, different types of memory, eye movements, information processing, and sensory gating. Now, we know that some of these neurocognitive impairments also have the following characteristics: that the ones that we see in schizophrenia in disproportionate numbers are relatively rare in the general population. They're heritable and they're stable over time. In the schizophrenia patients, these abnormalities are present during acute episodes as well as during symptom remission, and they're independent of medication status and chronicity. Also, these same abnormalities are present in higher proportions of the clinically unaffected biological relatives of the patients. And when neurocognitive impairments have all of these characteristics, we consider them to be markers of a genetic liability for schizophrenia, and we call markers of genetic liability endophenotypes. It's really exciting right now in research because we're making a lot of progress in terms of identifying and validating such endophenotypes. Examples would be eye tracking abnormalities, working memory impairments, and sensory gating deficits. Why would we want to study these? What are the advantages? Well, because these endophenotypes, these markers of genetic risk, are closer in the etiological chain than, say, symptoms, these markers can be an invaluable aid in the genetic dissection of the disorder. Because currently we know that genes are involved, but we don't know which genes are involved, how many genes need to be present, and how they affect brain development. We also know that not everyone at heightened risk for schizophrenia goes on to manifest the disorder, so we can study endophenotypes to identify those individuals at heightened risk, and then study them over time, follow them, to try to figure out why among the vulnerable individuals, some of them succumb to the disorder and others are spared. Moreover, we can use the study of endophenotypes to investigate whether certain indicators that have predictive validity at the population level also have predictive validity at the individual level. Now, we know that palliative treatment of schizophrenia can lead to considerable improvements in terms of quality of life, ability to work and live in the community. And studies indicate that the shorter the duration of untreated psychosis, the better the chances for a more positive outcome. Currently, there's some research projects that attempt to intervene with individuals who show schizophrenia-like functional deficits early on, but they have not yet experienced psychotic symptoms. Now, the goals of these early intervention programs are to detect early on emerging psychosis, to intervene to prevent further development of dysfunction, psychological dysfunction, to delay the onset of disorder if you can't prevent the further development of it, and to reduce treatment delay at the first episode. How do they get people into these studies? Well, it's based on an accumulation of risk factors, and they use a statistical risk-oriented approach. But we still don't know who our target population should be for these prodromal studies, and this is where markers can come in. Also, through the use of these risk factors and these endophenotypes, we would know which ones are the best screening tools for inclusion into these early trials, and how soon we should be including people. So at this point, we know that schizophrenia is a genetic disorder, and we're investigating the different neurocognitive impairments to identify the biological underpinnings of the disorder. It's really gratifying to participate in dispelling myths about schizophrenia and in educating the public about the disorder. Thank you, Chairman Deal, for the opportunity to provide testimony to the committee on this important health topic. And thank you, Representative Sue Myrick and Representative Tammy Baldwin, for your ongoing support of research and education in improving the lives of people with mental illness.
Well, thank you very much. I will begin the questions. You have talked about these markers of genetic liability. Did you call them endophenotypes or types?
Endophenotypes.
Types. Okay.
And endophenotypes are, they're closer in the chain, the causal chain, than phenotypes, which are the clinical manifestations, the symptoms of a disorder.
Would the same general statements about these markers apply to other disorders other than schizophrenia? Dr. DiPaolo, you're indicating yes.
Absolutely right. Yes, sir.
Right.
But they're better known in schizophrenia, for example, now than they are in depression or bipolar disorder, so that they are very helpful.
Dr. Ensel, are we further along in any of these three general areas we're talking about in terms of research? Since we've talked about schizophrenia, are we further along in the research for that disease than we are the bipolar or just simple the depression?
Yes, sir, I think we are. It's surprising. If one had looked at this 20 years ago, you would have expected that all the big breakthroughs in the genetics and in the biology would come out of bipolar disorder. And Dr. DiPaolo has been really at the cutting edge of that science. But much to our surprise, it's been in the area of schizophrenia where we've found the greatest association so far between genetic variation and having the disease or being, as Dr. Gooding mentioned, at risk for the disease. So right now, schizophrenia is the place where I'd say there's the most traction and the most excitement.
We've made the analogies to cancer in several different comments that have been made. And when we think of cancer and the treatment for it, we normally think of surgically removing it or treating it chemically to shrink the cancer or perhaps eliminate it altogether. I gather we're not able to make that same analogy in terms of the treatment of these mental diseases. Can you surgically remove something that would eliminate any of them? Can you chemically treat them to make it disappear or simply try to overcome what's there?
Well, if I may, I think the question really comes down to can we go from response to cure? And that's true. In the case of cancer and heart disease, we've set the goal at cure. And that's particularly true now with diabetes, where everyone looks for what is going to be the cure. Increasingly, though, in medicine generally, we are having to settle for being able to help people with chronic illness to be able to live better lives, what we now call more recovery than cure. And I think for us, the cure is not yet in sight for most of these disorders, but there are opportunities to reach for recovery, more than we've ever had in the past. And some of those are medical, some of them are actually psychosocial treatments. And we know, for instance, in the case of schizophrenia, that some of the treatments, some of the interventions that make the greatest difference are not necessarily medications, though those are necessary, but it's helping people with this chronic illness to be able to live with it by being able to be in a community where people are supportive, by getting families involved, and by getting them back to work, which is really essential.
Anyone else wish to comment on that? Dr. Gooding?
I would like to add that there used to be the myth that if you got the diagnosis of schizophrenia, it was tantamount to a death sentence or the prognosis was always very poor. we do have better treatments, and as Dr. Insel said, right now we're concentrating on helping people really further integrate into the community. We have a program that started actually in Madison, Wisconsin, the PACT program for assertive community treatment, that really worked towards bringing the focus of treatment outside of the hospital into the community. And it's a community-based multidisciplinary treatment strategy, and they meet patients where they are, and they help them get into the workforce, live independently, and really move towards recovery and self-actualization. So it's really gratifying to see the improvements and to really be able to tell people, okay, you've been diagnosed with this chronic disorder, but here are the things you can still do, and here are the ways we're going to help you get there, including psychosocial interventions, social skills training, and so forth.
Dr.
If
DePaul.
I could add one last little point, and that is to say that in the analogy to cancer, it was the appearance at the macroscopic level, at the eyeball level of tumors that led to the recognition that surgery might be helpful. But from the research in the molecular biology of cancer have come treatment strategies that we never imagined, such as treatment strategies designed through hormones, through the immune system, and through the blood supply to cancers. And so that those are the kinds of treatments that you can't imagine yet that we hope to come up with to aid all these other treatments in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression.
Good. Thank you. Thank you all. Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to hear a little bit more about the impact of recent cuts or flat funding of NIH with regard to the research. As you heard me proudly say in my opening statement, I represent the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which receives a great deal of support for biomedical research through NIH funding. And I've been hearing anecdotally from researchers on campus about the impact of recent flat funding in terms of grants cut short or experiencing their colleagues with very high-quality grant applications that are being denied at a much higher rate. No doubt these are because of congressional action and funding the NIH in recent years. I know in the past 4 years we have not kept pace with medical inflation, which is around 3.5%, meaning that the cost of doing research is increasing, but the funding available for the research is either flat funded or cut. I'm wondering if any of our researchers here today have felt the effects of these policies, and has it impacted your own research or the research that you're seeing of your colleagues? And additionally, how is it affecting recruitment of new talent, new investigators into the area?
As a chairman of a department that has 180 faculty members, I'd be happy to tell you, because the results are palpable and very visible. To the point, I think that my faculty has been extraordinarily stable across the years. When people come onto the faculty at Hopkins, they tend to die on the faculty much later, thankfully, and after very successful careers. But recently, in the last year and a half, I would tell you that we've been losing young, very talented investigators, actually several of them funded by the NIH, because they can see the handwriting on the wall, as they put it, and they are going to places that don't offer them the same kind of scientific opportunities, but where they'll be sure of being funded. So I'm very concerned about the loss of a generation of young, very talented investigators.
Dr. Jameson or Dr. Gooding, would you care to comment?
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more, and I think that it's such an exciting time in neuroscience, and it's such a time where you can really see things are really. All of us have lived with so much hype and promise for so long, and now in the last 10 years, it really has begun to just take off, and it seems the oddest, most strange possible time and devastating time to cut back. I mean, and it really will affect directly tens of thousands of lives. I mean, there's no question about it.
I can say that personally, I've been the beneficiary of NIMH grant funding, and it was invaluable in terms of being able to investigate the the risk factors and to follow longitudinally people at hypothetical risk for schizophrenia. And we found some really exciting things, and we would not have been able to do it otherwise. With the cuts in funding, or at least the flat funding, now we're being told we've got more ideas, my research lab, some of my colleagues, and it's really difficult because they're saying, well, this is a great idea, and yes, this would be very helpful in terms of furthering the field. But you know what? In order to get NIH funding right now, you're going to need to have a lot of pilot data. Well, how do you get the pilot data if you don't have the funding? So it's very frustrating.
Dr. Insel, would you care to comment on this? Or?
Well, I feel the pain from our side. As you mentioned, the biomedical inflation rate is somewhere between 3.5 and 4%, so that is part of our challenge. We do have about a doubling of where we were in 1998, so we are funding more grants. The grants tend to be larger than they were. I think we still are able to do quite a bit of great science, but this has been a time where we've had to set priorities, and the reality is that this nation invests about $4.76 per American for research on mental illness each year. And we have to ask not whether this is a cost center, but whether this investment is the right investment for the level of concern that you've heard this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Murray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jameson, I know you've done so much research and are an expert on suicide, and I wanted to ask you a question, but I also wanted to make a comment because we've talked about people who have the illness committing suicide themselves, but recently in our community, we've had two fathers from, living in great neighborhoods, good careers, normal lives, everything about them very normal. One of them who actually was successful in killing two of his own children. He did not take his own life. The other one tried to kill both his children, little ones, and one of them is still living, but he took his own life. And I share that because that's another aspect of this that we don't talk about, not just taking their own life, but taking someone else's life as well. But what percentage, do you know what percentage of bipolar people actually do end up committing suicide? Because I know a lot attempted. Our granddaughters attempted it several times, thankfully unsuccessfully. But any percentages on that?
Our percentages, depending on how serious the form of bipolar illness is. If you take people who have been hospitalized for bipolar illness, the rate of suicide goes up to somewhere between 15 and 20%, which is a higher mortality rate than most forms of cancer or heart disease. And I think one of the unfortunate things about psychiatry and psychology that as a profession, we have not used the words mortality rate when it comes to our own illnesses. Mm-hmm. And so there's this kind of notion that suicide is off there in the ethers and is caused by stress or caused by, things that go on in the environment, as opposed to 90 to 95% of the time being associated with a major psychiatric disorder. So I think we've done ourselves a big disservice by not focusing on how very strongly associated, and of the illnesses, of the major psychiatric illnesses, certainly bipolar disorder has the highest suicide rate. So it's a very real concern.
Dr. Insel, I was glad to hear you talk about personalized care for these diseases, just like we've done for cancer, and what you're looking in the future. I mean, that's really, really exciting. And yeah, I know funding is a problem for that, but that's something that's good on the horizon where we haven't been before. But either you or Dr. DePaula, I know you introduced me to the term of presenteeism some time ago, people who are actually present at work but don't do anything. Would you both elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that's something we totally overlook in society. We talk about people who are absent from work because they have problems. What about the people who actually show up for work but don't do it?
Since depression is probably one of the most common sources of that kind of lost productivity, I'd be happy to talk about it. And what you find from your patients is that one is, first off, when they're depressed, depression is not simply feeling sad when your dog dies. People have multiple inabilities to function, and the concentration and attention is certainly one of the things hit quickly and hard by depression. The second thing that happens is the idea that even having an interaction with somebody, going to see a client, going to interact with other workers to get something done, becomes a big stress for people. And so they tend to avoid doing that. And they tend to be more irritable. And so that people, when they are depressed, even although most of them are in the workforce, about 80% at least are working, they are unable to concentrate. They tend to withdraw a bit because of their both their knowing that they're irritable and also that they don't have the energy to sustain the interaction to get the job done.
And they're also more likely to use alcohol and drugs, which then compounds all the problems.
Which is a great point. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today, too, that the study says heart troubles often lead to depression. And it's talking about people who are depressed, who have heart attacks, which I just wanted to call to y'all's attention because it was, I thought, very interesting. On the schizophrenia side, Dr. Gooding, this is an area that I don't understand very well, and I read through your testimony, and so much of it's over my head, so forgive me. But I had one question, and that was about the when you talked about the multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia and how that's confused. Can you address that a little bit?
That's a common misconception. Multiple personality disorder, which now is called dissociative identity disorder, has to do with different personality states, different memories, and one aspect of the personality not knowing or having awareness of other aspects of personality. That's very different from schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is really a cognitive disorder in which there's some exaggeration of some functions like delusions, really false beliefs, hallucinations, false perceptions on the one hand, and that's what most people think about when they think about schizophrenia, but also, and perhaps more chronic and more devastating for a lot of people with schizophrenia, are we call them the negative symptoms, the symptoms that represent loss or diminution of functioning, and those are things like loss or lack of motivation, anhedonia, loss of pleasure, reduced speech, reduced expressiveness facially and emotionally. And so it's, as you can see, it's very different. It's not a disorder of, well, it's different. One is clearly a psychotic disorder where there's lots of evidence for genetic basis. And dissociative identity disorder, there's actually still a bit of controversy regarding the rates of diagnosis and the validity of it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just also wanted, our colleague Patrick Kennedy was here for a while and had to leave, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank him for being open about his challenges because that's a big help to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rush is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Enzo, can you tell me what the NIMH is doing with regard to research on postpartum depression and psychosis?
There's a broad range of studies that are looking at both the mechanisms and the best treatment for women during this period. It's a complicated area because there are many different syndromes that fall under the umbrella of postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis sometimes overlaps with that and sometimes is something quite different. No question that in some way it relates to the endocrine changes that accompany the end of pregnancy. But we still don't understand the mechanism by which that group, that profile of endocrine changes puts women at risk. We do know that the risk is huge and that the women at that point in life, especially if they have a history of depression, are many, many times more likely to develop a severe depression at a moment when their energy and their attention is perhaps more vital than at any other time to their infant. So it's an area of high priority for our institute and something that we hope to be able to have some real discoveries around very soon.
Do you have any opinion about the way that it's being viewed or the way that it's being portrayed or not portrayed in the as far as our legal system is concerned?
Let me just draw you out a little bit more on the question. I'm not sure precisely what your concern is.
What my question is, it seems as though there is a reluctance, a strong reluctance by the judicial system to even entertain the possibility that postpartum psychosis is a mental illness, and therefore those unfortunate victims find themselves in positions where they are denied really the full weight, I would say denied a fair trial.
So the science would certainly support the idea that this form of depression or psychosis, either one of them, are brain disorders, just as other forms of major depressive disorder and other psychotic illnesses. So we have that kind of an evidence to go with. We also know that they're treatable. But as we've been saying all morning, one of the gaps that we're facing here is that we have the science on one side, which often doesn't match up perfectly with public policy on the other. And part of the challenge is making sure that the science informs service at some point.
Does anybody else have any comments regarding?
Well, I think in general there's a huge gap between what many judges, for example, know about mental illness. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's an attorney not too long ago and asking him what kind of courses were taught in law school. I mean, given that so much of the law relates to human behavior and abnormal human behavior, what kind of courses are actually taught about psychopathology and the science of psychopathology? Next to none. I mean, which to me was staggering, because we all know the cases that have come before the courts with postpartum psychosis where a mother has killed one or more children, and how dreadful that is and how preventable often it is. But what strikes me is that highly educated lawyers know very little about psychopathology, despite the fact that the ones who are in the criminal system don't, or deal with it all the time. They don't know much about the science.
What's even more dreadful to me is, and I'll give you an example. I have a bill that's pending in the Congress. It's called the Melanie Blocker Stokes Postpartum Depression Act. Melanie Block Stoker was a young African-American woman, a professional, came from an upper middle class family, was a sales agent, sales manager for a leading pharmaceutical company. She married a physician. She had a disease nobody didn't know what it was. She committed suicide, jumped out of a 10th floor at a downtown hotel on a bright Saturday afternoon, left one child. And her husband was a physician, and he had no understanding. He had never heard of postpartum psychosis. So even the medical profession itself is also ignorant about this particular type of disease. And I think that it probably has a lot to do with the fact that it affects women most of all, and there's a disparity in terms of women's concern about women's health. But I'm just astounded that even members of Congress, Mr. Chairman, even members of Congress, when I went to get co-sponsors on the bill, invariably, out of all the people that I've talked to, at least a third of them had some experience with someone who had postpartum psychosis. But we still have not been forward in our solutions or our aggression, our attempts to deal with this particular issue. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time. I'm going to have some additional questions if we go through a second round.
Thank you, gentlemen. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for being out of the room for most of the testimony. But Dr. Insel, it comes to mind hearing your response to questions from others on the committee. Just as an outsider looking in, and I've only been here a short period of time, but as an outsider looking in, it can't help but feel like there's a lot of duplication, for want of a better word, when you look at the various institutes, the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Addiction, Alcoholism, and run through the list. Has that been at all an encumbrance upon the correct application of research dollars as you see it?
Well, as I think you've heard from Dr. Zerhouni when he's testified here, there's been a huge new thrust to try to coordinate all of the institutes around projects like the NIH roadmap, which are across institute and involve a integrated and shared approach to the biggest impediments in biomedical science. I might add that because of the institutes that you've mentioned in the last 2 years, the groups that are interested particularly in the brain and mental disorders and drug abuse have also developed their own integrated effort, which is called the Neuroscience Blueprint. And that is actually very much like the roadmap, in which rather than having redundancy or duplication, we're actually bringing the best from all those institutes together to try to address some of the common problems. And there are many common problems because we're all ultimately dealing with the central nervous system. But we come at it either through the eye or through the ear, or in our case, through abnormal behavior. But we have this opportunity now to do this in a very integrated way, and I think it's working very well.
Is that in a form where it could be shared with members of Congress at this point, the Neuroscience Blueprint?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to submit that for the record. We're in our second year. We have a very active website. Have about, I think, 15 or so projects that are already funded, maybe more than that, and we can get you up to date on all of those issues.
Well, I'll leave it up to the chairman as to whether or not he wants it in the record, but I know my office would very much appreciate being informed of that, because you're correct, Dr. Zeruni did, in his own inimitable way, imply that perhaps Congress shouldn't be interfering with the makeup, but he also acknowledged that there was, at least to the uninitiated outsider, he could understand how the appearance of duplication of services might lead one to believe that perhaps is not the best and most efficient application of research dollars. In your written testimony, talking about the new things that are going on between understanding of the human genome and neuroscience, it actually sounds pretty exciting. Can you give us any specifics to things that you're working on in particular there?
Yeah, very quickly, as we were mentioning before, I think the greatest traction happens to be right now in schizophrenia, where we have a whole range. I think there are 8 or 10 what we call candidate genes, where there seems to be an association between variation in a particular gene sequence and risk for the disorder. But hands down, the most exciting opportunity now is what's called whole genome association. And that's been made possible by something called the haplotype map, which is a map of human variation at the genetic level. So it's a map of where all the most common variants are in the human genome. And the opportunity to scan those very, very quickly in a way that we never imagined possible 5 years ago, quickly and cheaply. All of this has really come about in the last 6 months. The whole human genome HAP map will be available later this year, but we have a very good working draft that's already had a tremendous impact on a whole range of disorders, and we expect that now to affect the way we look at variation and the molecular basis of risk in mental disorders as well.
And do you see a day on the horizon where that will be generally available to the clinician?
Well, that's the big challenge, Dr. Burgess, is how you go from having an exciting research finding that explains, let's say, 5% or 3% of the risk, to being able to take that out and make a difference for clinicians. Where I think it will come first is not actually in the diagnosis of any of these disorders, but in the selection of treatments. So we already have evidence that's just come out in the last 6 weeks that we can predict who is more or less likely to respond to a serotonin reuptake inhibitor treatment for depression. And I think we'll have a number of those genetic variants that tell us about medication response. As you know, we call that pharmacogenomics. That's going to be the first, I think, the first deliverable, and I think that's going to happen very quickly.
It's no secret that, in my mind at least, managed care has not done a thing for the practice of psychiatry in this country. But one of the unintended consequences was for someone like myself, who was in a more of a primary care field in OB-GYN, by default, I became the prescribing physician for antidepressants. And I can't tell you how excited I am to hear you talk about that, because so often I was left with my best clinical judgment as to which of this wide panoply of antidepressant medications might be the best one for this particular patient. And probably about 80% of the time I was satisfied with the result, but about 20% of the time I was not only unsatisfied with the result, I was struck by how wrong I could have been on the selection of a particular agent for a particular patient. So that, just as from the perspective of a practicing physician who had the practice of psychiatry forced upon him by external forces in the insurance world, I'm very glad to hear you talk about that, because I think it is going to make us much more effective in our ability to deliver care for patients. Now, Mr. Rush, who's I guess already left, talked a little bit about postpartum psychosis, and unfortunately was probably using depression and psychosis interchangeably there, where it is not actually well suited for that interchangeability. But you talk about in the imaging part of your discussion on an Area 25, sounds like where they took the alien from Roswell, but nevertheless, Area 25 in the brain that has some specifics to it. Have you looked into the management of postpartum psychosis with these imaging techniques?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. That study hasn't been done, recognizing that much of this research has really just emerged in the last 9 to 12 months, and much of it's still underway. So there's a lot of interest in moving forward with those kinds of studies for postpartum depression, but it has not yet been done as far as I know.
It, again, he alluded to the difficulty with the disease being much more common than people think, and yet at the same time, even an unfortunate individual who was a physician and married to a patient didn't recognize the signs. And I'll tell you, as a physician who's also a husband, it is sometimes difficult to recognize signs, not just of postpartum depression, but from other more common illnesses. I think I missed the diagnosis of chickenpox with all 3 children. We don't need to put that in the record, Mr. Chairman. But a tool like
there
this,
forever.
a tool like this would be so helpful. And during the course of the day, the average OB-GYN who sees 30 to 45 patients in order to pay overhead and liability insurance, and has to make a decision based on a 10 or 15-minute interview with a patient who is struggling after delivery, to know which ones are truly at risk and unfortunately, as we've seen in Texas, some very famous and very dramatic cases of postpartum psychosis that resulted in the injury to, in some cases, multiple children within a family. The ability to be able to provide that practitioner with a reliable test that would be community-based or nearby in a community, to be able to say, I need to send you down to the medical school to get this scan done because I'm concerned about your symptoms. That would be tremendous to be able to put that in the hands of practicing physicians across the country. With that, Mr. Chairman, you've been very indulgent, and I'll yield back.
I think Dr. Insel wanted to respond, so I will allow him to do that.
Just in a moment, the NIH mantra now is what we call the 3 Ps. That's predictive, personalized, and preventive. And I think all of those together, if we can deliver that to individual practitioners, is where we want to be.
And Mr. Chairman, just a point of personal privilege, coming to Congress, I did not realize what a national treasure the NIH was. I have taken now a series of field trips out to various of the institutes out there. Every time I do that, I come back so impressed with what's going on and so optimistic about the future of our country and what we're going to be leaving for our children, because you guys are doing work out there that is nothing short of fantastic. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pickering, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank the Congresswoman from North Carolina for her leadership. It was great to hear a physician on the committee, Dr. Burgess, as he engages. And it is truly remarkable, the progress that we have made in understanding mental illnesses. And as Congresswoman Myrick has appropriately defined various brain diseases. I'd like to ask Dr. Insel, what we have seen over the last 10 years, what would you see or describe over the next 5 to 10 years, our understanding, our ability to do the 3 Ps, to be able to predict whether a child born next year could be susceptible to autism-related disorders? or to mental illnesses, bipolar, mental depression, and to what degree will we be able to both give the therapeutic predictors or our plans and help with our physicians and our psychiatrists and psychologists and to our families, and to what degree will the pharmacological prescriptions be enhanced to really make a difference in the lives of a lot of individuals and families. So what do you see over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's a tall order. Let me just give you the 10-second overview, which is that the 3 Ps will come about largely with the 2 best tools we have now, which are genomics and imaging. And you could probably add to that some better kinds of neurocognitive batteries, as Dr. Gooding was talking about for schizophrenia. We've already seen this with autism, that although we don't have the genetics yet and the imaging hasn't been particularly informative, with some of these other neurocognitive tools, we've taken the diagnosis of autism way, way earlier from, well, 5 years ago, where most children were being diagnosed at age 4, 5, or 6, depending on their level of access. We're now able to reliably diagnose autism well before age 3, in some cases before age 2. And that is critical, because we know that if we can intervene early, that we can, in some cases, preempt many of the worst aspects of this very devastating illness. I wish I could say that we can now do the same thing for schizophrenia. We're not quite there. But there's no question that through the use of genetics, through imaging, through all these other kinds of tools like neurocognitive batteries, the vision is very much the vision that we've had for cardiology and cancer. And that is that we get to a point for, let's say, schizophrenia, that we're intervening well before the first break. Just as with heart disease, we now intervene generally before the first heart attack. And so much of what cardiology is about now is preemption. It's treating people with lifestyle changes, with diet, and sometimes with statins to keep them from having to have a heart attack. We need to be taking just that pathway forward for schizophrenia, for bipolar disorder, and for autism.
Anybody else on the panel like to? And what policies can we adopt to help accelerate? If Dr. Burgess was talking about getting the scanning and the imaging capabilities out to the physicians and to communities, what are the things that this committee can do, both in research and in practical resources to the communities, hospitals, physicians, that will help accelerate?
Yeah. Well, if I might, I mean, and I will say that, you know, we all have the dream that we're going to be able to, quote, translate a basic science finding into a deliverable treatment. And so far, those things still take years to do. So that's why I think that the war on cancer and the serious work that's being done on heart diseases, I consider them about half done. I think that one of the things you can do is to obviously not only increase funding for research, but to make it predictable so that it won't be varying up and down so much. That would be very helpful, I believe, and I think Dr. Insel would probably be very much happier. He could plan ahead for beyond the life of a particular grant. And I think that's also extremely important, as we were saying earlier, for the careers, because we don't just need money. We need young careers of people who are going to devote their lives and their careers to this. And you don't want to cut off a generation of those people. So certainly those are 2 ideas. I think in terms of translating, I think we need a number of things to happen on the clinical side, but certainly I don't want to neglect the idea of public education. I still think that that's fundamentally important, and when people know what they have, they become much better. In some ways, the comment to Dr. Burgess is that we find that it is easier to educate patients sometimes than it is to educate physicians who weren't trained at a time in which a certain development took place. So those are certainly points I'd make.
And educating parents. I mean, I think one of the things that's always striking to me is parents learn about mondo bizarro diseases that kids never get, that are very rare diseases, and they learn next to nothing about depression and bipolar illness, which are very common illnesses. And it seems to me that pediatricians and doctors who are primary care physicians have an obligation to not only learn themselves, but also to transmit that education, and also through the school systems. One of the things that's great, I mean, Hopkins, for example, has a very aggressive program into the Baltimore public and private schools to educate kids, teachers, and kids, in fact, and parents about depression. You know, I just think this should be much more common than it is. So there's one thing, what can you do in terms of research that's going to affect people 10 years from now? What can you do to keep people alive now with what we do know?
I guess I'd like to echo that and just say that education is so critical. Increasing public awareness, not just about mental illness in general, but about specific warning signs or specific help-seeking or specific behaviors that would lend oneself to realize that maybe they should start seeking help. And we also need to educate people. They need to know that, well, you know, there are more advances now in terms of mental health treatment, mental health research, so that you don't feel that there's no hope and that you do go and follow up on the treatment recommendations. Furthermore, we need to educate people so that we can reduce stigma, because people are not going to go and admit to having problems, and they're not going to seek treatment if there's stigma associated with doing so.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you.
And I would be interested to follow up just on how much we are spending on the educational side of educating and informing the public, but I know my time is up.
Well, thank the gentleman, and to the panel, very excellent testimony, and any documents that you wish to submit, Dr. Insel, one of the references to the question from Dr. Burgess about that study would be certainly appreciated, and we will, without objection, allow that to be included in the record. I want to thank the panel very much for your distinguished testimony. And I'll now call the second panel to the table. Oh, he's already asked questions already. I don't believe we've got time to do a second round of these. We probably need to get this second panel up there.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to ask for unanimous consent. I would like to, there's some questions I had of the first panel. I'm sorry I was out on the phone, but I would like to submit the questions in writing
Yes.
so that I might be able to get some.
I have already done a unanimous consent that would allow any member to do that, and certainly I think they would be willing to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Well, likewise, we have a second distinguished panel. We want to thank all of you for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce them at this time. Jennifer Martin is an attorney who is in private practice in Topeka, Kansas, and she's here today to talk about her struggle with severe depression and her efforts to treat her condition. Mr. Gil Lamphere, who is a capital fund manager. Mr. Lamphere has a very distinguished business record, having worked at Morgan & Stanley as a vice president and in many other areas in the business world, and is in 1998 founded Lamphere Capital Management, where he is the managing director. And Mr. Peter Early, who is a journalist and author, New York Times best-selling author, and a former reporter at the Washington Post. We are pleased to have him here today, and he's going to talk about his son's mental illness and the family's experience in dealing with bipolar disorder. We're pleased to have all of you, and once again, I would say to you, as I did the first panel, your written testimony is in the record, and we would ask if you would to use your 5 minutes, please, to summarize that and talk about issues that are of concern to you, and thank you. We'll begin with Ms. Martin.
Thank you, Chairman Deal. I want to thank the chair and the members of the committee, and especially Congresswoman Myrick, for holding this hearing today and allowing me to testify on this vitally important issue. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here testifying in front of the House of Representatives about my own mental illness, I would have told you that you were crazy. That certainly I wasn't crazy, and I was never going to be crazy. I grew up in the Midwest, outside of St. Louis, in a normal, everyday, average household. I have the same parents I started with. We have a dog and a picket fence. Life was perfect, but inside the family, I knew of depression. My mom had suffered from depression, from postpartum depression, and generalized major depressive disorder her whole life. It was always untreated and only once diagnosed. Her sister, my aunt, committed suicide in 1987 from diagnosed but untreated bipolar disorder. So it was always the specter in my family. And I had bouts of depression, the blues, things like that, but I thought that was normal because in my family, everybody suffered from depression that was undiagnosed, and so that was my normal life. I sort of thought that once I grew up and got out on my own and had my job and had my life that, I would be happy and things would be fine. And so I kind of pushed aside those empty feelings or the bad feelings that I had. I graduated from the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law in the top of my class. I was recruited by the two largest, most prestigious firms in Kansas City, went to one of them, and had what everyone thought was the perfect life. I made great money, I had good friends, I had the perfect job, I had a perfect life, but I was absolutely miserable. And the fact that everyone kept telling me, oh my gosh, you must be so happy with yourself and life is great, made it worse that I would go home and sit by myself and be miserable on a daily basis. And we've talked over and over today about stigma and the stigma of mental illness. When I first started working at the law firm, I was told, don't let them see you sweat. Don't let them know that you're stressed because they'll think you can't handle the work. And so I was able to push those feelings down, but then I had to be there. I had to make billable hours. I had to work 7 days a week, and I didn't have any recovery time. Partners kept asking me, what's going on? You're not meeting your billable hour requirements. And it was like I had a secret life. I mean, during the day, I was, a hotshot young associate, and then at night, I was binge drinking and using drugs in an effort to mask the pain and mask the depression that I felt. And I can't even explain what it's like to live that secret life. For people to say, oh, you have a perfect life and everything is rosy, and then to be, doing cocaine on the weekends and waking up from a bender not knowing what had happened the weekend before. I was really sick, but I couldn't tell anybody because of the stigma that was associated with depression. I mean, after all, smart people don't suffer from mental illness. I learned eventually that I did suffer from major chronic recurrent depression. I finally sought treatment with the help of the insistence, and then with the help of a friend. In November 2003, I started receiving counseling and antidepressant medications, and at that time it was covered by the big firm, and I had a great insurance program, but it was too little too late, and not a month and a half after I started my treatment, I was called in by the partners and said, we think you need to find opportunities outside the law firm. Apparently my lack of a team player attitude combined with my constant hangovers and runny noses were being noticed, even though I thought I was doing a good job of hiding it. And then once I left the big firm and went out on my own, suddenly I was no longer able to get health insurance coverage because I had a mental illness, and I couldn't even get basic coverage in the state of Kansas where I lived because of that diagnosis. And I was lucky. My parents have been able to foot the bill for me for the last few years that I've been out on my own, but I pay over $400 a month just for my mental health coverage, and not everybody has the resources that I had. Today I'm recovering from depression. I've been in recovery for about 2.5 years. I just got married 3 weeks ago. Life is going really great for me, but I do relapse. And when I do, I know that I'm not lazy or overly emotional or just feeling sorry for myself. That's why I'm so grateful and honored to be here today in the U.S. House of Representatives. Since I began speaking out about my depression just recently in an effort to reduce the stigma, I've been amazed by the millions of people who suffer from depression and the many people that I meet. Just on the plane here this morning, someone saw me working on my testimony and preparing, and they leaned over and started telling me their story of a friend who'd suffered from bipolar disorder and committed suicide. In February of this year, I made my first trip to Washington, D.C. with the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance to introduce their groundbreaking research paper, The State of Depression in America. And I had the honor of sharing a podium with Mr. Mike Wallace and Representative Patrick Kennedy, and we all three got to talk about the effects that serious mental illness has had on our lives. And by removing the stigma of depression and helping people recognize that depression is a real illness, we bring the shadowed illness into the light of day and give millions of people who are now quietly suffering from this excruciatingly painful illness the opportunity to seek treatment that we know can and really does help. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lampier.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Stuckey from the great state of Georgia, who I had the privilege of working for some 30 years ago, always told me that if everything had been already said, when your time came, you better tell some good stories, and that I'll try to do within 5 minutes. A couple of years ago, I was suffering in the third year of what would be characterized as the 99th percentile of severity of depression, a serious case. I had taken some 27, 28 medicines. None had worked. That 27, 28 did not include any cocktails or combinations of medicines, which would have boosted that number considerably. I had had 41 electric shock treatments, which were effective until the last 10 or 12. And during all this, I had had a very supportive family and wife, but things proved a little too much. And I lost my wife to divorce, lost the family, lost the apartment, lost a good deal of my liquid assets, lost my job. And finally, I was poured into a seat on the Acela and taken down to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins. And Dr. DiPaolo was there, and his predecessor, Paul McHugh, was there. And I said, gentlemen, you got to pull out all the stops. I don't care what the side effects are, pull them out. And so they went back and got a class of drugs that was over 35 years old, called Parnate. It's an MAOI. Rarely used, very hard to find in the drugstores, even in New York. 35 years old. And they combined it with a drug that was less than 2 years old, called Geodon, that had been invented not for depression, but for hallucinations, for schizophrenics and for bipolar with hallucinations, but had been found by Johns Hopkins to be very, very effective in lower dosages with depression. 30 years old, year and a half. And then the magic bullet was lithium and then Lamictal, which is a mood stabilizer with antidepressive qualities. And they handed me that lobster roll, and they said, enjoy, because we think this is it. And one day later, I felt better. I said, let's put some more lobster in that one. And we added a little bit more, and I felt that much better. I said, just keep going. And sure enough, by the fourth or fifth day, I was back to my old self. And I think the story I want to leave you with that is that I don't know if I could have made it if I didn't have the support of my family, at least until the end, or had the great wealth and the perseverance, but the money to have taken advantage of the finest doctors in this country and finally find a teaching hospital that had the ingenuity to find the combination that would bring my particular predicament to a resolution. My first point I want to make, Mr. Chairman, is I honestly believe this is a physical illness. It is not a mental illness. And the sooner we get that fact out in the educational system, in the elementary grades, in the high school grades, the more people will understand. And let me tell you why I think it's a physical illness and what convinced me. I was having a great debate with one of the great psychopharmacologists in New York, one of the finest. And I was telling him psychologically that these people who went to work in the morning looked like ants with briefcases on a treadmill. I said, I don't know what they're laughing about. I don't know why they take pleasure in sitting under a tree away in the shade. And he said, Gil, this is not psychological. This is all physical. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you pay, I can't pay, and healthcare is not going to pay, but why don't you go down to NYU on 16th Street and we'll take some brain scans. So I went down there and they hooked up 25 electrodes to my head and it looked like a Christmas tree. And it was bright red here. There's a beautiful blinking green here. It was blue and white here. And we got here, and I said, well, that's the overview, but where's the detail? And they said, that is the detail. It's black. It's black. It's not working. It's gone. And I realized, well, this is like charging a battery. You have to have in the charging battery the right chemicals. You've got to have the right jumper cables. You have to have the right ignition. And you've got to permeate that brain, which has been referenced today. I mean, the brain is designed to keep all this stuff out with good reason. But you've got to get it through there. And so it takes a long time to cure this illness, oftentimes. And we talk about some of the illnesses, high blood pressure and diabetes and broken arms and Band-Aids. That's exactly what this is. It's a physical illness. And our panel before us can talk about a lot of the environmental things that happen that we think are causative, that people are prone to. And there's no question about that. But what happens is there's a snap. And that brain goes black. And I think that's what we've got to get across today. It's a physical illness. And I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Early.
Thank you. My name is Pete Early.
Would you push the button there?
Okay. My name is Pete Early. I'm the author of Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness. I'm also the proud father of a 27-year-old son, Mike, who happens to have a brain disorder. His illness surfaced while I was in college in New York. His brother called me one day in a panic, said, Mike has gone crazy. I drove immediately to New York to get him from my home in Virginia, and it's difficult for me to tell you how painful it was to ride home with him on that day. During the 4-hour drive, his moods would shift within seconds, crying at one moment, laughing at the next. He said to me, Father, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself? I did what any parent would do. I drove him to an emergency room. And I'll never forget the intake nurse rolling her eyes as Mike described how he was getting secret messages from God. We waited for 4 hours. A doctor came in. He came in with his hands up as if he were surrendering. And he said, I can't help your son. I said, you haven't even looked at him. He said, it doesn't matter. Your son has told the nurse that he believes pills are poison. And under Virginia law, I cannot treat anyone against their will unless they're in an imminent danger to themselves or someone else. Take him home and bring him back when he tries to kill himself or kill you. The next 48 hours, I watched my son sink into a mental abyss. At one point, he had tinfoil wrapped around his head because he was convinced the CIA was reading his thoughts. He slipped out of my house. He broke into a stranger's house to take a bubble bath. 5 officers had to go in and wrestle him out. They took him to a community treatment program. I arrived, and the policeman outside said, unless you go in there and you tell the psychiatrist that your son tried to kill you or kill himself, he will not be admitted. I'm sorry. I said he hadn't done that. He said, it doesn't matter. Under the law, he has to be in imminent danger to himself or others. So I went in and I lied. My son was put in the hospital. A few days later, the police called me. My son had been charged with 2 felonies, breaking and entering and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. Our laws had stopped me from getting him help. Now the laws wanted to punish him for a brain disorder. As a father, there was little I could do. As a journalist, I could investigate our system. I quickly discovered that Mike was not alone. Because of deinstitutionalization and our flawed system, there are 300,000 persons with severe mental disorders in our jails and prisons, 500,000 on probation. 700,000 go through our justice system every year. The largest public mental facility in the United States is not a hospital. It's the Los Angeles County Jail. Mike ended up being sentenced to 2 years of probation. He completed treatment. He took his medication. Everyone told him mental illnesses are chemical imbalances. They're biologically based. The heart gets sick. The mind gets sick. There was nothing for him to feel ashamed about. But when Mike told potential employers that he had a mental illness, his application was rejected. My son has a college degree. He was refused a job bagging groceries. 6 months after Mike's probation ended, he stopped taking his medicine. Because of my research, you would think that I'd be smart enough to protect him. But I found myself again being stymied. When I called the Fairfax County Mobile Crisis Unit for help, the dispatcher asked if Mike were dangerous. Not yet, I said. Then there's little we can do to help him. I begged, I pleaded, I badgered my son to take his medicine, but he refused and he got worse. A month ago, 4 weeks ago, his mother and I called the Fairfax County Mobile Crisis Team. Mike had become violent. The dispatcher told us, call the police. We don't answer calls if a person is violent. I was afraid of the police. I was afraid they would arrest him. I was afraid they'd harm Mike or he would harm them. So I called a social worker who's a close friend who works with the police department. He got out of his bed at midnight and came over. He insisted that the police call a sergeant who was equipped with an electric stun gun, a taser. He was sent to our house. Mike ended up being shot twice with a taser. He was hogtied, and once again, he was taken to a community center instead of to the jail. It took us 3 hours before we could see a doctor on duty. Luckily, he agreed to hospitalize Mike. It took 3 more hours to find a hospital with a vacant psychiatric bed, and it only agreed to take my son after it learned he had insurance. I live in one of the wealthiest counties in America. It can take a person with a severe mental illness 6 months to get into a treatment program, 2.7 years to get a case manager, 17.5 years to get into subsidized housing. You've asked me what it's like to be a parent of a person with a mental disorder. Each time my son laughs, I wonder if he's taking his medication. Each time he becomes sad, I wonder if he's headed for another relapse. Each time the phone rings, I shudder. I live on an emotional cliff, waiting for the next breakdown. But I also cling to the hope that Mike will find a way to control his illness, that science and therapy will curb his disorder. I try to focus on persons, such as my fellow panel members, for inspiration, and I look to you for leadership. Leadership that will bring an end to the criminalization of persons with mental illnesses. Leadership that will bring about sensible reforms. Leadership that will enable Mike and other sons and daughters to get help and not be turned away by a doctor who says, bring him back when he tries to kill himself or kill you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you. Very courageous testimony that we've heard, very heart-wrenching, quite frankly. Mr. Early is someone who has been a former juvenile court judge myself. I can empathize with the situation that a parent is in. Unfortunately, these diseases, as you have heard from your testimony and as we've heard from the expert panel earlier, the onset, many times is at the age beyond which the law says that they are independent and therefore not subject to the control of parents, and yet parents are the ones who feel the impact of these situations as you have so graphically described. I guess I would ask some general questions of the three of you, and you come at this issue, quite frankly, from sort of different directions, one being the parent and the other two being the victims themselves or the individuals suffering from the problem. Looking back on your situations, I suppose, Ms. Martin and Mr. Lamphere, what could have been done earlier in your personal situations that would have made a difference in the direction that your life took? And who and what would have been the resources that could have been that difference? Very general question. Ms. Martin, I'll start with you.
I think the way I could have been most help was my family knew that I was suffering from depression, but my mom, especially having suffered from it herself, was of the attitude that you don't talk about it, you don't tell people about it, you keep it in the family, and you don't get help because, you know, therapy is for other people, therapy is for people who are weak, therapy is for people who, you know, are whiny. And if I had been aware of the benefits of treatment and had someone talk to me about how there shouldn't be a stigma with mental illness, it would have prompted me to get help a lot sooner instead of taking it to the point where I lost a job and I lost income and I you know, lost a lot of self-respect. So I think just an initial, almost an intervention of someone in my family who knew what was going on to say, you need to get help and you need to get it now. And it's okay to get that help. It's okay to admit that you have a mental illness.
Mr. Lamphere, you appear to be the rugged individual here who tried to do it on your own. Is that pretty much the course that you took of trying to do it yourself? And if not, what resources did you utilize?
No, I had, my wife was right there until almost the very end. And I would say this. There are general practitioners who can dispense antidepressants, and then there are psychiatrists who can dispense them, and then there are psychiatrists who have depressive experience, and there are psychopharmacologists. And then you begin to get into teaching level hospitals, and then you can get into real cutting-edge teaching. And this is so complicated to find the right medicine. You cannot just take Wellbutrin, I'm not picking on Wellbutrin, but off the shelf and think that that's going to work. And you can't just take Paxil next and think that that's going to work. You're looking for a witch doctor is what you're looking for. And you've got to get far down the line to someone who truly understands the combination of drugs that are apt to bring you up. And I think that's where I would have done it differently. I don't think I would have started here and said, oh, these people are experts, or that the drugs are experts in and of themselves. It's the utilization of the cocktail. You're creating the cocktail, and you need to have the cutting-edge people. And on top of that, I would only add one other point. The treatment of adolescents is a whole nother area of specialization. And so what I'm talking about is adult, but don't forget these age groups over here are real specialties. And if you're dealing with a son or a daughter in that age group, you've got to find the expert there too.
Mr. Early?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when my son starts to become psychotic, he thinks he's fantastic. And expecting someone with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia to treat themselves is like asking someone who has 2 broken legs to run a marathon. The National Institute of Mental Health has done a number of studies that show one of the first parts of the brain that starts to go bad, if you want to use that terminology, is the part that makes you aware that you need help, which is why it's so frustrating for parents and others who love mentally ill persons to try to get them help when they don't recognize they need it.
Well, I want to thank all of you. Ms. Baldwin, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for very powerful testimony. I mean, you all point out so powerfully how important it is to educate. Mr. Early, I wanted to explore further one of the main issues that you testified about. I remember when I was a state legislator, having our state legislature tackle the issue of what in Wisconsin we called the fifth standard.
Absolutely.
Dealing with the issue of when you have a patient who does not want treatment, as you just described, under what circumstances treatment can be administered against that patient's will and direction. And I remember that the debate was fascinating, and it is one that's usually governed at the state level, but I'd be interested in hearing more about your thoughts of where you would like to see the state of Virginia go. In Wisconsin, we ultimately created a fifth standard that you could get around the at imminent risk of harming oneself or another person. But I remember the very powerful testimony of a man whose wife was mentally ill, and it never manifested itself in any type of dangerous activity in terms of life-threatening to herself or to others, but she wandered and was homeless, and it was just devastating for him to see her in that condition. So dangerousness wasn't an element that would have necessarily gotten care to her. I wonder if you have thoughts through both Mike's experience and also your reporting on this of where you believe the states ought to go in terms of getting greater access to treatment for people in your son's conditions.
Thank you. You know, I love my son. I want to protect his civil rights. But I don't think it does any of us any good to send someone out in his kind of condition when it's obviously he's not thinking clearly. I think you have to take a look at why these stringent commitment laws were passed. In the 60s through the 80s, we had these horrific institutions. They were absolutely horrible. They were compared to Nazi concentration camps. Civil rights lawyers came in and basically said, we're going to make it impossible to commit someone to these horrible places, and they have done that. I don't believe we should trample civil rights, but I think we need to take another look at those laws and try to bring parents and doctors in them and try to remove this imminent danger clause. Treatment today is different than it was. We know more. It's not, no one volunteers to be schizophrenic. My son has been forced into the hospital twice. Each time has been less than 2 weeks. He got his medication. He thanked me for taking him in. You know, we have protections in place with advocacy funded by Congress to make sure that people don't get abused and put away. Does it happen? Absolutely. Look at the D.C. situation. It's horrific. You know, people are being abused. But right now, people are being abused in jails and prisons. Right now, in Miami, 4,500 people are being housed in assisted living slums by the state that don't even pass minimum standards. So we've closed down these institutions, but we've just hidden the people better. So I think we need to look at the commitment. I think we need to be more humane about that. And I'll be real brief here, but what you just mentioned is what I found in Miami. 455 people with serious mental illnesses, homeless, on the street. Most of them commit misdemeanors. So what happens because they're not dangerous? They go into jail, they're held, and they're released 40, 50 times a year. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Right. Let me just ask another, your opinion on another innovation that I had heard discussed. I don't know of any location where this might actually be law, but there was at one point during our debate in Wisconsin the proposal of allowing somebody with a mental illness to essentially, when treated, issue an advance directive and basically be able to say that if some point in the future I have a reoccurrence, and I am not able to make my own decisions at that point, use this advance directive as permission to treat me. Is that something that you think would be worthy of exploration? Would that have served, would your son, for example, at a point in time when he is under treatment and feeling better, be willing to sign something like that?
You know, I've looked at that, and you have a mixed result. In some states, they're not accepted. In some states, what you'll run into is a doctor, like I ran into in the hospital, who basically will turn to someone and say, well, you signed this, but how do you feel now? And they'll say, well, I'm fine, and they won't abide by it. You know, so I looked into that in Virginia, and I found mixed results.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield
Thank
back.
you. Thank you. I want to thank all of you again for coming and taking your time. Mrs. Early's birthday's today, and I just wanted to tell her thank you, because she took time from her birthday to be here with us. We appreciate it very much. Yes, excuse me.
I do have a question.
I'm sorry, Mr. Rush. Forgive me.
It's quite all right. Ms. Martin, you indicated in your testimony that one of your remedies, or one of the things that you attempted to do, you found yourself falling into, I guess you implied that it was use of narcotics or drugs, different types of drugs. And I really feel as though that's a part of the drug problem across this nation that doesn't get addressed. Again, we are quick to criminalize those who have addictive behavior rather than really try to understand what is the causes of it. And in your testimony, you indicated that your mental condition, your illness, was the basis of your drug abuse. Is that correct? Could you elaborate somewhat on that, please, that particular aspect of it?
Certainly, Mr. Rush. It was the basis of my drug problem. I'd never touched any kind of illegal drug until I was 22 years old. I had just finished my first year in law school, and my depression that I'd kind of dealt with off and on and had issues with was getting stronger, and it was pushing more and more forward. And suddenly I had friends, and I knew people who were using drugs, and I tried them for the first time and was happy for the first time ever. I remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. Now I know why people do drugs. And for me, it wasn't that physical addiction that people talk about. I never, and when I stopped using drugs, I never went through a withdrawal or any kind of thing like that. It was completely, I did it completely as self-medication to feel better.
I kind of think that's, I have a son who's a recovering alcoholic, and he's been diagnosed as manic depressive, okay? And he invariably, at certain points in times, I think he's been clean now for a couple of, about 2.5 years, but he was self-medicating through alcohol abuse. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that, particularly in poor communities, that is much more prevalent when because they don't have access to preventive or diagnostic or clinical services and professional help, that is a part of the problem in terms of drug abuse and also alcohol abuse and using illegal drugs. Mm-hmm. And it seems as though our nation just don't want to look at that particular aspect. Has anybody else got any comments that you would like to share on that? I mean, that's a hidden part of what, Madam Chairman, I think that's a hidden part of what is missing here.
I think it is a hidden part, and to some extent, what you're saying about it being prevalent in the poor communities because they don't have access is completely true, and therefore they self-medicate that way. And then if you get into a more an affluent area of society, you see people like myself, and I had several friends who did the same thing. We didn't want to admit that we were suffering. We didn't want to go to a doctor and get help. We didn't want to seek any kind of outside assistance, so we used drugs. SSRIs work on the brain by stimulating serotonin and causing your brain to release serotonin. That's exactly what ecstasy does. Ecstasy floods your brain with serotonin. And so taking an ecstasy pill for me was like, you know, overdosing on my antidepressants. It was amazing. And people don't focus on that. They think, oh, you're just spoiled kids out having a good time, or you're poor, or you don't have adequate resources. Well, people really are missing that hidden side of drug abuse and alcohol abuse that is self-medication that makes us feel better.
You're back? Thank you. You're right. That is an issue we don't talk about. Our granddaughter did the same thing without question. I had a question of you, and I'm glad you're talking about that issue, by the way. I hope you'll keep on doing that.
I'll try.
My question was, what was the final straw? I know you lost your job, but what was the final straw that made you say, I need to get help?
I actually wasn't losing my job. I knew I was about to lose my job. I'd had people in my office saying, you know, what's the matter with you? You don't seem like you're enjoying yourself. I was regularly asked if I was suffering from some sort of nasal condition because my nose ran a lot. But it finally kind of came to a head in the fall. My grandmother had passed away, and what was pretty much just a weekend binge became an all-week obsession. And I had a very close friend who had suffered from depression and mental illness and was one of my drinking buddies for the longest time. And he finally came to me and said, you have to stop, or something bad is going to happen, and you need to go get help. And so that was kind of the final straw, was when the person that I drink with most of the time says, you're drinking too much, then you kind of know you're in trouble.
It was an intervention by a friend.
It was, yeah.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, yeah.
Mr. Lamphere, again, thank you for being here. I was glad to hear you talk about this being a physical illness because, you know, my point in this hearing has been this awareness issue of brain disease, and it's no different than heart disease and diabetes and all the other things that we deal with. But we seem to take our brain and put it over here on a shelf, and then here's our body over here. So please keep doing that. But was there anything in your life going through this that you would have done differently? If you look back on it, is there any point where you would have realized, can you see anything now that would be helpful to other people possibly?
There is some interesting work going on just beginning in New York now. I think people have felt that depression always was a causative item of divorce because of the extraordinary black vortex that sucks the spouse right in. And, and work being done on what is the middle ground that a spouse can take in that. What is interesting, though, to answer your question, is the research that's being done, which is, did the marriage cause the depression to begin with, and the drinking or anything else behaviorally that started? And I think people might need to start thinking about that, that they've been depressed for long periods of time and maybe self-medicating, and it has to do with the relationship rather than anything else that needs to be addressed that could be the causative item of the depression.
I appreciate that. Mr. Early, you've done a lot of research on the prison systems and the jails and the problem that government's paying for, and I hope you'll continue along those lines. I have a son who works in that field, and he tells me continually, and the percentage of people that are in prison who have a problem with their brain and the drugs or alcohol, et cetera, has, you know, gotten them here. And I think we've got to face those tie-ins that we haven't looked at before as a society, because they're very real. And as Mr. Rush was saying, those are areas that sometimes we don't look at. The frustration that you've experienced, I know, is very difficult, and the system is a mess from the standpoint of what you can do. We've gone through that with our granddaughter. That's why it took us 6 years to get her diagnosed because she wouldn't stay anywhere long enough because the laws would say she could get out.
Right.
And you could never get her diagnosed. You know, recommendations that you have, and I know we don't have time today, but anything that you can share with the committee and any of you of things that we could do, as Ms. Baldwin was saying, that would help would be very beneficial, because some of what we've done has caused the problem, and then you get all these jurisdictional problems in addition that, of course, we can't do a lot about, but nevertheless, there are some things that maybe we could work on, and you could be very helpful if you'd be willing to work on that as well.
Well, I appreciate that. I think if you look at deinstitutionalization, the population that was in state mental hospitals, as it goes down, jails and prisons went up. You know, one of the quick answers, one of the quick fixes, every police department in this nation should have a crisis intervention training program, CIT. Fairfax should have one. None were available. These are officers who are trained to deal with people with mental illness. In Miami, the year I was there, the Miami Police Department, I saw them disarm a man with 2 knives without him getting hurt. He later thanked them. That same time period, the Miami-Dade Police Department killed 5 people with mental illness because they didn't know how to take care of them. CIT, it's just like bomb squads, hostage rescue. Every police department should have one of those.
Very good advice. Again, thank you all very much for being here, and there's no further questions. Chairman Deal? Then that concludes our hearing for today. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and we are adjourned.
I recognize your name from investments.